So when you've decided that you're going to do some kind of statistical analysis in an applied setting, you have to first decide what statistical software you're going to use. There are a number of really good paid software packages that have good support systems and a variety of features. But if you find yourself in a not-for-profit or a small for-profit or in another circumstance where budget may not allow you to pay the high price that some of those packages have, you'll probably be looking for some kind of free software. There are a variety of free statistical analysis packages out there. Some of them are better than others. All of them have some trade-offs compared to buying a full-featured, high-cost paid version. What I'm going to do is I'm going to work particularly here with the JASP statistical analysis program. JASP is an open source free software, so it's basically changing across time as new modules are added, and you have to kind of take into account the realities of working with open source software. On the other hand, it's free, and in my years of working with it, I frankly have never had a big problem. I've never had anything crash or any data loss or anything like that, so I feel pretty comfortable recommending it. It does, however, have some limitations relative to the feature sets of paid software. Okay, so if you want to use JASP, then the first thing you have to do is you have to basically go online to the JASP website and gain access to it and download it. It's at jasp-stats.org, jasp-stats.org. Say that fast 3 times. And you can download the program, and then when you open the program, it looks like this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to walk you through the program, and I'm going to walk you through some of the realities of what you might need to know to use it for basic applied statistical work. This is version 11.1. I believe that came out in October of 2019. This is March of 2020 when I'm recording this. So it's a relatively recent version of it. When the newer versions come out, sometimes they're a little less stable. They have some problems in them in open source software, generally speaking. Although, to be honest, I don't recall ever, even with a really recent version of JASP, having any problems. So you just take into account how old of a version you want to use. And periodically, you need to go and check and see if there's a newer version and decide if it's been out long enough that bug patches have been done, that you're willing to download the newer version and gain whatever features that newer version has that the older version doesn't. Okay, so if you're using JASP, you'll have to do potentially some of your data set work in a spreadsheet program. Now, the full-featured paid versions of statistical analysis programs allow you to do not only all the statistical analysis in the program, but allow you to do all of the data set work in the program. JASP allows you to do a number of data set work things, but they're not as helpful, not as clean, not as quick, but it does a great job with all the statistical analysis side, and the program's free. So you may find yourself at times needing to go into the spreadsheet where the data is actually stored to work with it, or you may need to go into the spreadsheet to do some things that you find easier to do in the spreadsheet than you find doing them in the actual statistical analysis software. The third thing you're going to probably need if you work with a program like this that you might not need if you did a full-featured paid software is you're probably going to need a code book for the data set you're working with. My example today is going to be the 2018 General Social Survey from the National Opinion Research Center, but you might build your own data set, a simple data set where you ask the satisfaction levels of the clientele who come to the agency where you work, or the organization where you are doing something and you have a program intervention and you have measure before and measure after to see if something changed in the clientele. You may have a simple data set that you've built yourself. Even then, you may have to build yourself a code book because a lot of the information that you might have in a larger program like SAS or SPSS or something like that, where it actually shows you what each variable measures, and it in the program itself shows you the labels for the different code values that cases may have. Some of that isn't as available in JASP. Some of it isn't available at all, and you'll need a code book that actually lists all that information that you can go and refer to. All right, so you're going to create a data set. You're going to create it in a spreadsheet or in some other program of some sort. And to get it into JASP, you're going to need to save it as a CSV file. CSV is comma separated value file. It basically means that if you have a series of variables that were asked of a bunch of cases in a survey, for example, if I was a respondent in that survey and I was asked 5 or 6 or 20 questions, then my first answer to the first question would be in the data file, and then you would have a comma a delimiter, a comma separated value. So a comma, and then my answer to the next question, and then a comma, and then that's how the data is stored, which is commas between the different data values. That's a really common way for data to be stored. Now it has a minimum amount of information. It just has, for every case, the values they have on the variables. It doesn't have information about what any code values may stand for, strongly agree, agree, and so forth. It doesn't have information about what any variable is actually measuring. All of that would be in your code book. All right, and so you open it in JASP, and then you can do some data set manipulation in JASP, or you can do it through the spreadsheet connected to JASP, and then you save it in JASP as a JASP file, and it'll have the information that you've modified. I'll show you that in just a second here. Do recall that all kinds of things can go wrong when you're working with statistical analysis programs, just like any program. You might have something go wrong with the program, something go wrong with your computer. You might just make a mistake in what you yourself do. So you should keep an archived version of the data set when you first create it, and not just have one version that you then make modifications to, and then that's the only one you have, and if you make a mistake, you have no previous one to go back to. So archive the original data set, and then you might think about just periodically, every time you make a big change, add variables, label things, do big changes in the data set, save it under a new name. So I might say, if I'm using the General Social Survey 2018 data set, I might have GSS 2018 version 1, GSS 2018 version 2, GSS 2018 version 3, as I go along changing things in it to manipulate the data into the form where it can do the kind of analysis that I need done to answer the questions I'm asking. When you do that, you might want to just add notes at the end of your code book about what changes were made in which versions, so you can quickly figure out which version you need to go back to if at some point you made a mistake and you deleted something you should have kept or changed something that you shouldn't have changed, and so forth. Okay, so in JASP itself, there are a variety of things that you can do with the data set itself. So let's go ahead and open JASP. And what I first will show you is you have a hamburger menu, as they're called here, the 3 lines. And when I go to those 3 lines, I can actually get a menu that allows me to open data sets, save data sets, those kinds of things. Now, I've done a variety of different data set work with this, and let's see what I have here. Let me grab some glasses. So I have the General Social Survey in a variety of forms. Here I have it as a CSV when I'm first pulling it in. You can see I've saved it as a JASP file in a couple of different versions for different purposes, and I have a short version of the GSS. I'm just renaming these data files as I do things with them so that I can remember which one has the different kinds of data that I want. Let's go ahead and pull in the full 2018 GSS that was put together for SOCH 355 spring of 2020. So it's a CSV file, and JASP is going to load that CSV file, and it gives us what we're used to seeing in terms of a spreadsheet. So here's our spreadsheet view, and we basically have every case on a row, and we basically have every variable on a column, and we can see the year that each case was participating in the survey, and we can see the ID number that was given, the work status value, which doesn't mean anything because as a survey question, we don't know what a 1 stands for or what a 3 stands for, and so forth, and so forth. So you have all the different data on the variables for each case. Now, if you want to go on to save this in certain forms, do certain things, you certainly can. This pull-down menu gives you a variety of ways that you can save the data set. All right, so what I want to do, I've shown you the data set menu. What I want to do is I want to now show you some of the basic data set work that can be done in JASP. So let's say that we're going to work with this work status variable. V3 WRK-STAT. Now the WRK-STAT is the original naming convention for the variable that was put into the variable when it was constructed when the first data collection was done. I have added to all the names on my variables the V1, V2, V3, V4, because I find it easier to reference and find variables if I simply have them named in a way that I go, oh, V29, and I know it's the 29th variable in the data set when I go to choose it for analysis. Whereas looking for them with just alpha names doesn't allow you that kind of latitude. So I've changed all the names of the data set in this example. All right. And I did that, by the way, in an Excel spreadsheet, but that's a topic for another time. All right, so here's my work status. Now, a couple of things to notice. First of all, 351155, I don't actually know what any of those codes mean. So maybe I need to go back to my code book. Here's the code book, the full code book for the General Social Survey. This is a cumulative code book from 1972 to 2018. It has all of the questions that have been asked across all those decades, and it has information about what every code value stands for in the survey. Now, this is over 3,000 pages long. You don't want to just try to print this. But I need to look for something about that work status variable and figure out what in the world those codes stand for. So I'm going to hit Control F, and that's going to open a search feature. Control F is a common hotkey combination to do searches in most programs. And I'm going to say, well, I remember it was called WRKSTAT. So remember the V3 I added. So WRKSTAT, and there we go. It jumps right down here and it finds it. And in this 3,000 plus page code book, it lists all the names and it gives you a mnemonic description. This isn't literally what was asked. This is just a statement about what was measured. And it's about labor force status. Oh, okay. Now I'm going to, it's got an option up here where I can go forward and backward. I'm going to go forward, and the next time it shows up is in this place where it says, last week, were you working full-time, part-time, going to school, keeping house, or what? This is the actual question that was asked in the survey. And this is the name of the variable, workstat. And this is what the values stand for. Now, it's called a punch code only because there are some lingering terms from decades ago. When I first did my very first programming class, it was literally on punch cards. You may have to Google that to figure out what it is. But there was no input-output interface through dumb terminals, even much less graphic user interface. And so everything we did was put onto manila cards by punching holes on the right letters or numbers. And so there would be a card for a whole series of cards for each case. And if one was punched on this particular column, it would mean they were working full-time. If a 2 was punched, it would mean that they were working part-time. And so we still call it the punch code, but it's basically just what does a 1 stand for, what does a 2 stand for, and so forth. So a 1 is working full-time, a 2 is working part-time, a 3 means they're with a job but not at work, a 4 means they're unemployed, a 5 means they're retired, 6 means they're in school, 7 means they're keeping house, and 8 is some other answer, and 9 says they chose to not answer. All right, it's not that they weren't asked, it's that they chose to not answer the question. Okay, so let's jump back over to JASP, and here in this work status variable, I can click right here on the name, and it gives me the ability to relabel the variable. So a 1, we recall, meant that they were working full-time, and a 2, you'll recall, meant that they were working part-time. This is a rather laborious way to do this. I'm going to have to go through and I'm going to have to change all the codes on this. I'm going to finish this over here, but you can see now the 1s and 2s have actually, well, the 1s have. Apparently I didn't hit enter when I did the part-time, so let me go back and at least get part-time in there. There we go. And 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 and 9 could also be labeled as well. And unfortunately in JASP, you don't really have the option of just copying labels that are commonly used, strongly disagree to strongly agree, and just pasting them in on a bunch of other variables. You just have to go in and label each code and each variable one by one. More fully featured paid versions of programs actually give you easier ways to do this. Okay, now you could go into the spreadsheet and you could actually put in these code names instead. you could go in and do a global search and replace, and you could choose to do this on multiple columns at the same time. So there are ways to do this in the spreadsheet that are faster. But in the spreadsheet, it's also easier to end up making mistakes if you're not familiar with working with spreadsheets and end up messing up your data. So you'd have to decide where you want to do this. All right, but if you're only working with a few variables, you go in and you put some labels in, and that's the first thing to do. Now, so what we've done here is we've seen how we use the dataset menu, how we can label the data values for particular kinds of variables that have code numbers instead of counts, and how to use the code book to find that information. But you probably have also noticed, if you're familiar with levels of measurement, that this says that work status, it has a little bar chart here. A ruler indicates that this is a scaled variable. It's either interval or ratio. A bar chart indicates that it's an ordinal variable. Well, this isn't an ordinal variable. This is actually a nominal variable. So if I click on this little emblem here, it's going to allow me to change it to nominal. And now it will have a little Venn diagram looking thing that says this is a nominal variable. So now I have it with the right measurement type, and I have some labels put in, and I would of course put all the labels in if I was taking the time to do this. Dataset work can be long and tedious and frustrating, but it is just part of the job. All right. So the next problem I have, you'll notice in the work status variable that I pointed out that there was a code value, 9, that said they refused to answer. Well, this is a non-valid value. I want to know their work status. And if they have a value of 1, it means something about their work status. They're working full time. If they have a value of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, it tells me something about their relation to the labor market. But a 9 just says they chose not to answer. That's not validly measuring their relation to the labor market. So what do I do with those missing data? In fully featured programs, there are different ways to interface with this variable by variable. In this one, there's not that choice. So I go back over here to this menu, and I go to Preferences, and then I go to Data, and it's going to allow me to set missing values. Now, I have actually set -1 to missing already in this data set. Originally, that would not be an option. JASP always treats not appropriate and periods. By default, it has those in there as missing values. But I've added -1 because -1 is commonly used through this data set as an indicator that people were never asked the question. It's not appropriate to them. So I want all the -1s to just be set aside. No -1 should be taken into account anytime any analysis is run. But then, variable by variable, there are some other things that are involved here. So for example, I can add oh, there we go. Finally let me do something there. I can add the value of 9. And now the value of 9 will also be, I see I put a space in there. A value of 9 will also be missing data. But here's my problem. For the work status variable, that's great. All the people who said 9 will no longer be counted or considered when I do analysis. And I don't want them counted or considered. That's great. But there are other variables where a 9 is a valid value. And in JASP, this is a universal setting of missing values. So if I have some variables in the analysis where a 9 is missing data and some variables in the analysis where 9 is not missing, then I can't actually set my missing here. I'll go ahead and set 9 to missing for now. All right. So what I want to do next is I want to point out a couple of things you're not likely to do quickly, but I've set them aside here, computing new variables, filtering the cases. But if you get a little further down the road, you may say, from the old variables that I have here, the original variables, I want to create a new one. If I hit this plus mark up here in the top right corner of JASP, I can actually name a new variable. I'm just going to call this one junk because it's not a real variable. Okay, I'm going to hit enter. And so now it's giving me a workspace where I can take existing variables, like I could take number of hours worked at full-time jobs plus number of hours worked at part-time jobs, and I can compute a new variable. This is the way that I create new variables from the original ones that can allow me to measure things. I can do all kinds of mathematical transformations. You see over here on the right side, I can calculate all kinds of things statistically. I have a bunch of operators up here at the top that I can choose. All right, I'm just going to cancel out of that, and I'm going to discard it because that's not really a variable I want. But that's how you would do it. Now, you also have this little emblem at the top left right here that allows you to filter the data. So I can now take a variable and I can say, well, I'm going to do an analysis and I want to include work status, but then I'm going to basically say I'm going to use some kind of operator or some kind of specifier to indicate exactly which values of work status or which cases in the end I'm going to include in my analysis. Okay, I'm going to discard this as well. But that's the way if you say, well, I just want to be studying women for a moment, or I just want to be studying people who are working full-time, the filtering option is where you would do that. Okay, so those are the basic ways that you can do dataset work in JASP. But you'll find oftentimes that you need to do the dataset work in a separate spreadsheet to do something a little bit more elaborate, or frankly, to do something faster or more comprehensive. Okay, I'm going to do a little splice here. I changed my mind on the order I want to cover a couple of things, and so I've restarted part of the recording here. So we had talked about how you were going to do some kind of data set work in JASP itself and the different kinds of things you could do there. And now I want to talk a little bit about how you're going to do data set work in a spreadsheet. All right, so in JASP, I have this data set open. I could directly connect to the spreadsheet by double-clicking on any cell in the spreadsheet view. But I find that JASP and spreadsheets tend to have a slow and clunky communication with each other. So what I tend to do instead is, with this very data set that I've been working with now, I actually go ahead and close JASP, and I'm going to go to my Excel, because that's the spreadsheet that I'm using. You could do it in Google Sheets or whatever. And I'm going to actually, in my spreadsheet program, I'm going to actually go ahead and just open the data set here. So if I go to that GSS SOC 350, now here's what I want you to see. This is why I went back and redid this, because doing it the other way, you don't see this step, and I realized that this would be good for you to know. If you open a CSV file in a spreadsheet program, or at least in Excel, it's going to say, do you have a delimited file when it just sees that it's just basically a text file, or do you have a fixed value width? We have a delimited file, which means that every case value on each variable is delimited from the others by a comma or a tab or something. Fixed width is an entirely different thing to be discussed at some other time. But I'm going to say next, but look at this representation of the data down here. So for the first case, the first row that has values, you have a value, comma, a value, comma, a value, comma. And that is the set of values that that case has on the different variables in the data set. Now, you don't realize it, but there's a problem with that. I'll say next, and it'll say, well, what kind of delimiter are you using? And by default, it thinks that it's going to have tab delimiters, but I'm going to say I also have comma delimiters. And now, where it had commas, it separates the case values out into the set of variables. And now I will actually have columns in the data set when I open it in Excel that align with what I'm expecting to do. Otherwise, it would not turn out the way I need it. Now, if I do next, I actually just get an opportunity here to do specialty identification of certain columns as having certain kinds of unusual data. You're really not likely to run into that ever. So I'm going to hit finish. It's going to open the data set in its full form. And now I'm looking at the same data set I was working with in JASP, but now I'm looking at it in the Excel spreadsheet. So what I want to do is I want to talk about some specific things you might want to be aware of if you're going to be doing some work in the spreadsheet. Now, one of the benefits of working in Excel is I have the option here of going into the data menu, the data ribbon, and in the data ribbon choosing filter. And when I do that, what it's going to do is it's going to basically, you see a little arrow appear at the top of every column, and I can now click on that arrow to sort by that column. But what I really did that for is because it has now locked all the values in each row together. If I didn't have that turned on, then when I went to sort, I could choose this, and I could sort using the home ribbon sort option. I could sort that column, and it would sort that column alone. It wouldn't leave the values in that column with the actual case they're in. It would shuffle them from high to low or low to high. And now the values aren't aligned with the correct case. But when I chose that filter option, it actually allowed me to lock the rows together. So now if I sort using this little pull down, I can sort these things. I can do different kinds of things. Then I can filter by numbers and so forth. Then I can actually make sure that the rows stay locked together as cases, and that's very important. So the other thing, another thing I want to show you is that in this work status variable, you recall that when we were dealing with this work status variable, we were noting that there were missing value categories. There was a value of 9 that said these people chose to not answer the question. So what I want to do is I want to go out to the Find and Select menu and choose Replace. You see I've highlighted that column for the work status, and I'm going to look for the value of 9, and I'm going to just leave it blank what it's going to replace with. Something to keep in mind, whenever you do this, I'm going to say Replace All, and it's going to find every 9 that's in that column. And, oh, I already did this. You can see I just did this as I tested it before. But it will tell you how many it's replaced, and there were actually 2. So 2 cases are now blank cells, where before they had a value of 9. And now I don't need to set the global missing value of 9 in JASP to do my analysis, because there are no 9 values. I got rid of them here in the CSV file. Okay. Keep in mind that your variables have names, and this one's V3 work status. What if I had decided to search this whole column and get rid of the values of 3? Well, it would find the number 3 in that name, and it would make it go away there too. So be aware that when you're changing things, it's affecting everything in the column, and you could in fact need to go back and rename your variable correctly afterwards. All right, and then finally, you can do some elaborate construction of variables here. Okay, so if I decide to insert a variable here, I may decide that I want to take work status, and I want to take the value of the work status times the number of hours. Some way or other, I'm algebraically or mathematically creating some new value. Instead of doing it in JASP, I can do it here. And if you're familiar with the ability to create new values or to use formulas in spreadsheets like Excel, once you learn that, it's a higher learning curve, but once you learn how to do that, it's a lot faster in many ways to do data manipulations and data reconstructions and transformations in Excel than it is in JASP. Okay, so that's my Excel program. Let me, I'm not going to bother to save that, but you see what I did is I basically made the missing go away, and I would have saved it, and then I would reopen it in JASP. So I'd go back to JASP. Let me start JASP back up. Bring it back over here into the captured screen. Okay, so now in JASP, I can go and I can open the data set that I've been using recently. And if I had saved the data, it would now have the 9s gone in the work status variable, and that would allow me to do what I needed to do there. All right, so the only last things I want to talk about here is I want to give you some idea of how you'll run analysis. Every one of these tools that I'm going to point out, we are going to have a video that walks us through how to do it. We're going to use the framework that I gave in the previous video, and then we're going to apply it to doing categorical analysis and scaled analysis and so forth. But let me just point out really quickly the way this would work. So you have a bunch of pull-down menus that you can now work with this data set. You can do descriptive statistics, you can do t-tests of a variety of sort, you can do ANOVA, analysis of variance, and a variety of other types of analysis. You can do correlation, you can do linear regression, you can do contingency tables, which you may be more familiar with as a cross tabulation. They're also called contingency tables. And I, for my own strange reasons, like to call them comparisons of distributions, because in essence that's what you're doing, is comparing distributions. And then there are some other analysis options as well. Now, I'll make one quick point that you see in JASP all of the list of statistical works tools, and then you see these Bayesian versions. All of these tools that aren't identified as Bayesian are what are called frequentist or classical statistics. Those are the statistical tools that everybody learns usually in an intro to stats class. Bayesian statistics are an alternative way that's based on prediction of probabilities instead of the frequency counts that tend to underlie most of what happens with traditional or classical statistical techniques. Well, let me just give you a quick example of what I'm going to see. I'm going to go ahead and make this full screen. I'm going to do a descriptive statistics, and I'm going to go ahead and use that work status variable. Now notice when I chose to do descriptive statistics, it opened an interface here where I can choose variables, and it then immediately gives me the results once I've chosen them. So if I want to see the data set, there's a little arrow off here on the left edge. I can go back to see the data set. I can go back to seeing the analysis choices and the results. The analysis choices interface always has some options down here. In this circumstance, it has some statistics I might choose to add. I currently have the mean, the standard deviation, the minimum, the maximum, and so forth. But I think what I really want here is I want to click this little box and get a frequency table. So now you can see that I have 1,134 people with a value of 1, 259 with a value of 2, 53 with a value of 3, and so forth. And you'll recall that I just showed you how you could delete the 9s out, and I, in fact, had already deleted the 9s out before I even brought it up to show you. So there are no 9s now. There are 2 cases that used to have a value of 9, and now they're missing. They're empty. And so you have the percentages that include the missing or non-valid cases, and then you have the valid percent that indicates the actual percent who gave each answer of work status relation to the labor market. And then you have cumulative percent. Similarly, you can do any of a variety of tools. You can come over and do a crosstab, and again, we're going to have different videos that work us through this, but let's say that I think that your work status in some way affects your view of something. I'm just going to pick a random variable. Let's do something that is in fact measuring people's opinions about something. So I'll scroll down here and I'll say, you know, who did they vote for in president in 2016? And you see immediately it gives me the contingency table. It gives it to me in frequencies, and then I can go in and I can change in the cells to show column percentages or row percentages or whatever I need. I can choose statistics for strength. I can choose statistics for statistical significance. I can choose some different options that are available for laying out the table. Now, let's say that I look at this result and I think, boy, this result right here is something I want to report to someone. You can actually just click on the little arrow up here and choose copy, and then you can open Word or whatever program you're going to use. Let me bring Word over into the capture here. And I can actually just paste those results. And those results are, well, they're APA style at the time it was made, but APA style changes itself every so often. But it's basically in a style that's really appropriate for reporting professionally. Okay, so what we've done is we've looked at where the data set is, the analysis interface, and some of the pull-down menus of available analyses in JASP. And then you've seen the results pane, and we've seen how you might copy results. All right, so what I want to do is I want to close this video and begin to build a series of videos that walk you through using the framework that I've already provided. So we'll look at categorical dependent variables, and we'll have a video that talks about what would we need to do to look at distributions, and then a video that would look at cross tabulations, and then a video of controlled cross tabulations, and so forth. And central tendency, comparison of means, factorial ANOVA, central tendency, correlation, and regression, both bivariate and multivariate. And by the time you've watched all of those, the hope is that you will basically have a framework for doing statistical analysis in basic applied settings and answer immediate questions about whether we change our funding, increase a program's viability, whatever it might be. So I'm going to move on to those videos next.